On May 8, 2023, in Accra, Dr. Adu Ananan Antwi returned to Ghana's Ministry of Finance. He was not asking for charity. He was speaking for pensioners waiting on coupons and principal they believed were safe. Then the language changed. Debt sustainability had reached retirement money. This is not fiction. This was Ghana, 2023. Here's what makes the scene colder than a normal bond dispute. The pensioners were not holding some exotic offshore product. They were not chasing a private scheme. They were not lending into a shadow market. They were holding claims on the state, government bonds, the instrument every financial system teaches retirees to treat as the conservative corner of the portfolio. And yet by early May 2023, the convener of the Pensioner Bondholders Forum was telling Joy Business that if the government did not pay coupons and principal, the pensioners would resume picketing at the Finance Ministry on Monday, May 8th. The government, he said, was the issuer, and the issuer must pay. That sentence is the whole case. The issuer must pay. But what happens when the issuer is also the government? What happens when the debtor is also the rulemaker? What happens when the place you go to demand payment is the same place that has just redesigned the payment system? That is the mechanism this story exposes, not a default, in the simple street meaning of the word. Not a man locking a door and disappearing. Something filed through memoranda, exchange offers, eligibility lists, and revised payment dates. The account still exists. The bond still has a name. The paperwork still recognizes the claim. But the cash flow, the thing a retiree actually lives on, becomes negotiable. By then, Ghana had already launched its domestic debt exchange program on December 5, 2022, inviting holders of about GHCD's 177 billion in domestic notes and bonds to exchange old instruments for new bonds. The stated purpose was debt sustainability. The practical effect was to reduce the state's near-term cash burden by changing the timing and structure of payments. For a trader, that is a restructuring. For a retiree, it is groceries, medication, rent, school fees for a grandchild, and the quiet humiliation of standing outside a ministry gate to ask for money that was supposed to arrive automatically. That is why Dr. Antwi matters. He turns the abstraction back into a person. A retired citizen class had done what the system told them was prudent. They had trusted domestic debt because the state stood behind it. Then the state came under pressure. Safety was not removed from the bond. It was relocated from the retiree's calendar to the government's timetable. Before the exchange, the promise was simple. Not legally simple, but socially simple. A Government of Ghana bond was treated as a serious claim on the state. Banks held them. Fund managers held them. Insurance companies held them. Pension-linked portfolios held them. Individual savers held them because the hierarchy of safety had taught them where to stand. At the risky end, business ventures, then equities, then corporate paper, then the state. That was the latter. And for a retiree, the latter mattered because retirement is not a theory of return. It is a calendar. A coupon due in February is not just yield. It is the month's medication. A principal payment due in March is not just a maturity event. It is the repair of a roof before the rains. It is a school bill. It is the quiet bargain that says, I worked first, I saved second, and now the system pays me back on the date printed on the instrument. That belief did not appear from nowhere. For years, domestic government security sat at the center of Ghana's financial system. The Ministry of Finance's own DDEP materials later described the exchange perimeter as roughly GHCD's 177 billion of domestic notes and bonds, including Republic of Ghana instruments, ESLA bonds, and DACI bonds. The state financed itself there, and the financial system stored what it called safety there. That is the contradiction. The safer the instrument appeared, the more deeply it entered the machinery of retirement, not outside the system. Inside it. And this is where the official story becomes incomplete. The official story says Ghana needed a domestic debt treatment because public debt had become unsustainable. That is true. The ministry said exactly that when it launched the exchange on December 5, 2022. The first offer even emphasized that there would be no reduction in the principal amount of eligible bonds, while the new instruments would carry a 0% coupon in 2023, step up to 5% in 2024, and then 10% from 2025 onward. No principal haircut. That phrase matters, because to a spreadsheet, no principal haircut can look merciful. But to a retiree, a bond is not only principal. It is sequence. It is timing. It is the conversion of past labor into scheduled cash. Break the schedule, and you have not merely changed an investment. You've changed a life. This is why Dr. Antwi's appearance at the ministry gate was not a side story. It was the street-level audit of the entire repair plan. The pensioners understood something that official language softened. A claim can remain legally alive and still fail the person who planned around it. The paper can survive while the household breaks. And that is the first lesson of Ghana's DDT. Sovereign debt does not become dangerous only when the state says, "We will not pay." Sometimes it becomes dangerous when the state says, "We will pay differently." Differently is the word that empties the cupboard slowly, not all at once, not with a headline that says confiscation, but with a calendar that no longer belongs to you. That is why Dr. Antwi's sentence keeps returning. The issuer must pay. But in a debt exchange, the issuer does not only pay, it rewrites the timetable. That was the promise before the exchange. The state stood at the safe end of the ladder. The exchange did not merely challenge that promise. It asked every holder a colder question. Safe for whom? The retiree who needs the coupon on time? Or the state that needs time more than it needs consent? The official repair machine began with a sentence that sounded technical enough to feel distant. Domestic Debt Exchange Program. 4 words. And inside those 4 words was a transfer of time. On December 5, 2022, Ghana's Ministry of Finance announced the commencement of the exchange. The government said public debt had become unsustainable and that a domestic debt treatment was necessary to close a financing gap and restore debt sustainability. The invitation did not call itself a default. It did not present itself as seizure. It presented itself as repair. That matters, because repair is the language states use when the old promise has already failed. The original structure was clear. Eligible domestic bonds would be exchanged for new Government of Ghana bonds. Those new bonds would carry a 0% coupon in 2023, 5% in 2024, and 10% from 2025 onward. The ministry also emphasized that the exchange involved no reduction in the principal amount of eligible bonds. No principal haircut. Again, that phrase. It sounds like mercy until you ask what the retiree needed from the bond, not the final accounting value in 2037, the coupon this year, the cash this month. The date that had been circled before the crisis had a name. Because a retiree does not live in maturity buckets, he lives between one payment date and the next. The new bonds were designed to stretch the state's obligation across time. In the launch documents, the exchange allocated old eligible bonds into new bonds maturing in 2027, 2029, 2032, and 2037, with the longest maturity taking the largest allocation share. That is the hidden mechanism. The state did not need to make the claim disappear. It needed the claim to move. The state did not cancel the retiree's claim. It borrowed the retiree's calendar. Move from today to tomorrow. Move from a coupon into a promise. Move from a retiree's calendar into a sovereign recovery plan. And by February 2023, the machine had worked. The ministry announced that the DDEP had closed on February 10, 23 with approximately 85% participation among eligible holders, and then announced that settlement and conclusion occurred on February 21, 23 for CAD-denominated notes and bonds issued by the government, ESLA plc, and Dacia Trust plc. Settlement. That is another word that deserves inspection. In a normal household, settlement means the matter is finished. In a restructuring, settlement means the old instruments have been replaced by a new legal reality. The problem has not vanished. It has been reorganized. And this is where the gap opens between official success and lived consequence. From the state side, the exchange reduces near-term pressure. It gives fiscal room. It supports an IMF program. It signals that domestic creditors have absorbed part of the adjustment. From the retirees' side, the same event can look completely different. A payment expected under one schedule is now governed by another. A security once understood as conservative becomes a lesson in sovereign hierarchy. The bondholder learns that domestic does not mean protected. It means reachable. This is the part most people miss. Foreign creditors can be difficult. External bonds sit in other legal systems. Negotiations can involve courts, collective action clauses, creditor committees, and reputational damage across global markets. But domestic creditors live inside the jurisdiction. Their banks are local. Their funds are local. Their regulators are local. Their settlement systems are local. Their retirement institutions are local. Their political pressure is real, but their exit options are limited. That does not make the restructuring illegitimate by itself. Ghana had a genuine debt crisis. The state had to choose between impossible options. Public debt stress was not imaginary. A country cannot pay every promise on the original timetable if the original timetable has already become mathematically impossible. But forensic analysis does not stop at the state's problem. It asks who became the solution. And in Ghana's DDEP, domestic creditors became the shock absorbers. Banks absorb losses. Fund managers absorb losses. Insurers absorb losses. Insurers absorb losses. Pension-linked portfolios absorb losses. Individual bondholders fought to be seen not as entries in a liability management exercise, but as people whose monthly lives had been built around those entries. Dr. Adu Anain Antwi understood that distinction. At the ministry gate, he was not debating an abstract yield curve. He was forcing a simpler question into public view. When the state restructures itself, who gets restructured with it? That question is where the technical repair machine becomes a moral document. Because every debt exchange has two ledgers. One ledger records debt sustainability. The other records who had to lend the state more time. The household trap begins with a strange fact. Nothing has to vanish. The bond can remain visible. The account can remain open. The government can continue to acknowledge the obligation. The retiree can still possess the paperwork, and the household can still be in trouble. Because the danger is not always non-recognition. Sometimes the state recognizes the claim and still breaks the life built around it. A coupon meant for medicine becomes a public dispute. A principal payment meant to end uncertainty becomes the beginning of a new queue. This is why the pensioner bondholders kept returning to the Ministry of Finance. They were not asking the state to discover a debt it had forgotten. They were asking it to honor a date. That sounds small. Until you are retired. A worker can sometimes replace timing with income. A business owner can sometimes raise prices, delay a supplier, or cut inventory. A young professional can take another contract. A retiree has fewer escape routes. That is the quiet violence of broken cash flow, not violence in the cinematic sense. No broken glass. No soldiers at the door. No dramatic decree read over the radio. Just a date passing. And then another. And then a person who had built an old age around certainty is forced into negotiation with the institution that sold certainty in the first place. Dr. Unwilling Antwi's role becomes important here because he translated this pressure into public language. As convener of the pensioner bondholders forum, he repeatedly pressed the government over unpaid coupons and principal, including the May 2023 threat to resume picketing if payments were not made. The demand was basic. Pay what had fallen due, not because the pensioners were speculators, because the state had issued the paper. And this is where the official phrase, debt sustainability, becomes morally incomplete. Debt sustainability for whom? For the ministry? Sustainability means the state survives the payment schedule. For creditors, it means the claim retains value. But for a pensioner, sustainability means something more immediate. The body survives the month. That distinction is almost never visible in aggregate debt numbers. 1 billion CDs can be moved across a spreadsheet with one policy decision. But one missed coupon enters a kitchen differently. It becomes a postponed prescription, a smaller food basket, a child told quietly that help cannot come this term, a retired man or woman checking the same account again, not because they misunderstand finance, but because the promise was supposed to be automatic. Automatic is the word. That was the emotional contract behind the bond. Not high return, not clever trading, not beating the market. Automatic payment from the state. When that automatic function breaks, the retiree becomes something else. Not merely a saver, not merely a bondholder, an unwilling creditor in a rescue plan he did not design. And that is the phrase that defines Ghana's DDEP at street level. Unwilling creditor. The pensioner did not vote on a recovery model. The pensioner did not design the coupon step-up. The pensioner did not choose the maturity extension. The pensioner did not create the debt structure that made restructuring necessary. But when the system reached for time, the pensioner's calendar was available. This is not a claim that Ghana had easy options. It did not. By late 2022, the country was seeking an IMF-supported program. Inflation had surged, and the government said the public debt path had become unsustainable. A restructuring was presented as the bridge back to stability. But bridges are built from something. In this case, they were built from changed promises. That is why focusing only on whether principal was cut misses the deeper forensic finding. The loss was not only in face value, it was in control. Control over timing. Control over panning. Control over planning. Control over the most fragile part of retirement. The assumption that tomorrow's payment will arrive, because yesterday's labor already earned it. Dr. Antwi's protest exposed the hidden conversion. Retirees entered the bond market as savers. The crisis turned them into lenders of last resort. Not by title, by function. And the function was simple. Wait longer so the state could breathe. The next question is simple. Who was caught? Because in every debt restructuring, the public language says the burden is shared. But the forensic record always asks a colder question. Shared how? Ghana's first DDEP design did not treat every domestic instrument the same way. Treasury bills were excluded from the exchange. Pension funds were also not part of the original DD perimeter. The IMF later noted that the domestic exchange covered about 65% of total outstanding domestic bonds and excluded pension fund-held bonds, in part to protect pensioners. That sounds like protection. And in formal terms it was, but formal protection is not the same thing as practical insulation. Treasury bills were too close to cash. Households used them. Banks used them. Businesses used them. Touching them would have sent a brutal signal. Even the shortest day paper could be rewritten. So they were left out. Pension funds were harder to name as ordinary creditors. They were deferred wages. No principal haircut. Again, that phrase, it is the salary you did not spend because the system promised that someone would manage it for later. But look at what happened next. pension funds may not have been eligible under the original DDEP, but they did not remain outside the restructuring story. Ghana's 2023 annual public debt report later stated that pension funds were not eligible under the DDEP, but that a specific exchange was launched to allow pension funds to disengage from the old bond market and access new bonds with greater value. The numbers were not small. GHAT's 29.6337 billion was tendered out of GHAT's 31.0594 billion in outstanding eligible bonds, a 95.4% participation rate. Behind that percentage was not abstract capital. It was postponed old age. That is the buried lead. Retirement money was not outside the state balance sheet. It was inside the room, maybe not through the first door, but eventually through another one. And that is why the Ghana case is so important. It shows how the word excluded can hide several realities at once. They were excluded from the first door, not from the pressure system. That is the detail. The word excluded hides excluded from one deadline, not excluded from the logic of debt sustainability. Individual bondholders and pensioner bondholders occupied an even more exposed position. They did not have the same institutional scale as banks. They did not carry the same systemic label as pension funds. They had voices, but not always leverage, so they organized, they petitioned, they threatened to picket. They stood in public view because private ownership of a government bond had become a public fight. That is the reversal. A bondholder normally expects the instrument to speak for him. The contract, the maturity date, the coupon schedule, the issuer name, these are supposed to do the talking. But in Ghana, retirees had to speak for the bond. Dr. Ado Anane Antwi became one of those voices because the paper itself was no longer enough. The claim needed a human face at the gate. The state had to be reminded that behind the exchange ratios and participation rates were people who could not eat an accounting treatment. And this is where the hierarchy becomes visible. Treasury bills were spared because touching them would have threatened immediate confidence. Pension funds were negotiated around because they represented deferred wages at institutional scale. Banks and asset managers absorbed damage because they were embedded in the financial system. Individual bondholders had to fight not to be treated as loose fragments of the same liability. The ranking matters, but the pattern matters more. When a state restructures domestic debt, it does not only decide which paper changes, it decides which social promises can bend, and once that begins, safety is no longer a label attached to an asset. Safety becomes a position in the queue. Who is too politically sensitive to touch first? Who is large enough to negotiate? Who is small enough to delay? Who is old enough to be pitied, but not powerful enough to be feared? That is the part Dr. Antwi exposed. The pensioner bondholders were not simply asking to be paid. They were asking whether old age still ranked as a protected claim when the state ran out of easy choices. Ghana was not an isolated warning. In September 2023, Sri Lanka showed the same mechanism in a different form. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka announced that the Employees' Provident Fund, the country's largest retirement fund, would participate in the domestic debt optimization program by exchanging its treasury bond portfolio. The choice was presented through two paths: participate in the exchange and continue with a 14% tax rate on taxable treasury bond income, or refuse the exchange and face a 30% tax rate on that same category of income. That is not the same legal design as Ghana, but it rhymes. The retirement fund was not standing outside the sovereign repair plan. It was inside the pressure system. Different country, same pressure point. Old age, sitting inside sovereign debt. The state needed debt relief. The fund held state paper. And the rules around participation shaped the economic consequences of saying yes or no. This is the modern pattern. Retirement systems are often sold as protected containers. Separate, regulated, long-term, conservative. But when those containers are filled with domestic sovereign debt, they are also reservoirs of state financing. And in crisis, reservoirs are noticed. That is the lesson Dr. Ado Anane Antwi leaves behind. A man at a ministry gate asking for a date to mean what it once meant. Not theory, payment. He did not expose a market theory. He exposed a position, the position of the retiree who believed a government bond was the end of risk, when in fact it was the beginning of a different kind of risk, rulemaker risk. The state owes the money. The state defines the emergency. The state negotiates the exchange. The state decides which instruments are excluded, delayed, converted, taxed, or politically protected. This does not mean panic is a strategy. Panic usually converts one risk into two. Panic usually converts one risk into two. But the forensic record gives a colder survival protocol. Do not ask only, who issued this asset? Ask, who controls the payment calendar? Do not ask only, is the principal protected? Ask, can I survive if the income stops for a year? Do not ask only, is this regulated? Ask, can the regulator change the rules under emergency conditions? Do not ask only, is this retirement money? Ask, is my retirement money funding the same state that may later need relief from me? Ghana's 2023 Annual Public Debt Report recorded GHCD's 31.0594 billion in eligible pension fund bonds, with GHCD's 29.6337 billion tendered, a 95.4% participation rate in the pension fund exchange. That is the buried lead. Retirement security was not outside sovereign debt restructuring. It was one of the places where restructuring logic eventually landed.